I sense that some of us are struggling a little bit as we go on. We moved out of the books of law and the whole story of the Exodus into, we had Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We did Joshua, Judges. People started, it's a lot. It was really heavy. It was a lot for people to get through. Joshua, Judges, Ruth was a breath of fresh air. And now we did First and Second Samuel, which was a little weighty, and people were kind of like, "What's this about? What am I supposed to be learning?" And now we're diving into First and Second Kings. First and Second Kings is actually one book. It's just like Samuel. It was divided into two parts because that was the length of the scrolls and the parchment at the time, and so that was a natural breaking point. But it actually is one book, the book of Kings. And so I'm going to try to, I don't know, just like give a little bit of an overview, teaching, help you be able to read it better and not be as overwhelmed. All of these books, I mean, the Bible in general, it's never meant for you to read it one time and completely understand and comprehend what it means, what God is trying to communicate through that. It's like layers, and you go deeper and deeper in. And so I'm going to try to give you a view of a couple of layers of Kings, and it really is just skimming the surface. We see throughout the Old Testament, God made promises to Noah. He made promises to Abraham. Then he made promises to the Israelite people as a whole at Mount Sinai. And then he's now making promises through David. He's continuing those promises through David. The promises of Abraham are now shifting, and David is part of the story. So we're going to see at the end of Samuel was the end of David's life. And so we're going to see in the beginning of Kings, David is old and he's about to transition his power to his son Solomon. We are talking about a period of time there was the period of the Israelites wandered in the desert. They finally get to the promised land. There's this time of the judges, which was a couple hundred years, where there wasn't a king and people kind of just had chaos, and these judges kind of kept track and kind of enforced God's law, but didn't do a good job. And so now that the people wanted a king, and so God said, maybe you don't want a king. I don't think that's going to make it better, but they wanted a king. And so now we're shifting into this period of the kings, which is like a period of 600 to 800 years after the Exodus of Egypt. So kind of get that some kind of timeline. Now remember, as a whole, the Old Testament is called the Old Testament or the Old Covenant. And we talked about the word covenant and testament meaning promise or legal agreement or something of that nature. We talked about early on that this is a document, a legal understanding like between God and his people, a contract. And so that's what's playing out and still unfolding through all of this history of the Israelite people. And now we're to this point where we have the monarchy established, and the monarchy, Saul was the first king, but God is establishing his monarchy with David, because David is a man after God's heart, is what God says. And David, we well know that he messed up and he disobeyed and wasn't always obedient. But the difference with David is that he was remorseful and repentant, and he really did love God. And so God made him promises. And so we're going to look at this part of the agreement that God is making between himself and humanity. So he's going to lay this out, and he's going to start with a promise to David, and then there's a problem that's going to happen. Then there's a price that needs to be paid, and then you're going to see a promise. So these four things, a plan, a problem, a price, and a promise, are going to be this first layer of what you need to know about the book of Kings. So right off, we need to start off with God's covenant with David. It's called the Davidic, I can't say it correctly, the Davidic covenant. And and we're going to read it right from God's words, what he promised David, and it's going to be in 1 Kings 2. So we're going to look at what exactly God promised David and what he promised the Israelite people. And we're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 4. And what's happening here is David is telling his son Solomon, make sure you do these things. This is what God expects. This is what you need to do. It's very reminiscent of what Moses told the Israelites as they were going to go into the promised land. Hey, listen, you're going to forget. Things are going to get good, and then you're going to forget. So this is what David tells to Solomon. And he says, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me if your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. So God makes this promise that the throne of Israel and the house of David is always going to be in the line of succession. But you notice how it says, if they keep their promise to me, if your descendants watch how they live, if they walk faithfully before me. So there's this plan, and this is the plan that God is unveiling. It's the same plan. It's just the next step in his plan. So he establishes this covenant with David, but there's a problem. And the problem arises with his son, Solomon. So in the beginning, Solomon, he looks like a great king, and he makes this decision. God says, I'll give you whatever you need. And Solomon says, it's common that we think of Solomon as having wisdom. And because we hear that story, and Solomon was wise, the wisdom of Solomon. It really wasn't wisdom that Solomon asked for and was granted. It actually is more substantial than wisdom. Solomon asked for the ability to tell good from evil. And that's a different thing. We're not talking about knowledges and square roots and mathematical equations and the answers to all of these things. Solomon asked to be able to discern good from evil. And that's reminiscent, of the garden and what happened there. The tree of life, when they disobeyed and ate the fruit, that's what the fruit would give them, the knowledge of good and evil. And what would this mean? And so Solomon gets that. And then we see him start to build the temple, which God said, David, your son's going to build my house and all of these things. And there's this moment, it's the pinnacle of Israel's history, the highest high of points, and then this problem arises. You see, God was very specific that when there was going to be a king for Israel, that the king was going to have to obey rules, and he set this all the way back in Deuteronomy when he told Moses and he laid it out. He knew in the beginning that the people would want a king, and he said, this is what you have to make sure your king does. And we're going to go look back at Deuteronomy chapter 17. And this is exciting because you see the story is unfolding. This is 600 to 800 years later. And Moses gave this warning and told exactly what he needed to do. And this is what it said about the kings. Deuteronomy 17, verses 14. The king. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and you have taken possession of it and settled in it, you will say, Let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. And it goes on to say all of these other things that the king of Israel will need to do. And Solomon, right after the temple's built and right as things are coming together, the problem arises and Solomon disobeys everything, the most important things that the king was supposed to do. And he knew these things. You know, it's said in here that the king needed to know the scripture, meditate on them, write it down. So Solomon knew Deuteronomy. He knew exactly what it said. And he still did not follow through. And we see right away after he builds the temple, Solomon, it's 1 Kings chapter 3, right at the beginning, it says, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because a temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. One sentence. He made an alliance with Pharaoh. He went back to Egypt. He married Pharaoh's daughter. All of those things right off the bat were all the big no-nos, the big ones that God said in the very beginning. And all of it came to pass when Solomon fell short. And that's really what did him in was his many wives from many nations. And, and the thing is, we know Solomon knew what was good and what was evil. And he couldn't overcome. He knew right from wrong, but he chose wrong. That the temptation, the falling in was too much for him to overcome. And so there was the plan that God had, the Davidic plan, and then there was the problem with Solomon. But here's the thing, there was a price to be paid. Because back in Deuteronomy, and this is where things are starting to fit together and puzzle pieces, and you kind of can see it unfolding. Back in Deuteronomy, after God talks about what the king should do, there's another part of Deuteronomy, and it's Deuteronomy 28, and it starts at verse 15, Deuteronomy 28:15. And it talks about it's called the curses for disobedience. So if you do this, Israel, if you have a king that does this, Israel, this is the curse. This is the price you're going to have to pay. And it starts off and it says, however, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all of his commands and decrees I'm giving you today, all of these curses will come on you and overtake you. And just this first section says, you will be cursed in the city and cursed in the country. Your basket, your kneading trough will be cursed. The fruit of your womb will be cursed, and the crops of your land, and the calves of your herds, and the lambs of your flocks. You will be cursed when you come in and cursed when you go out. And it goes on and on and on, and it talks about famine. You'll be cursed with the land will be desolate, disease, madness, mental illness. It says that the pregnant will be ripped open. They will be unsuccessful in everything you do. You will be oppressed, robbed. At one point, it even says you will eat your own children. These are the curses. This is the price that you have to pay if you don't fulfill the will, the promise. And so the plan was never to have all of this happen to Israel. The plan was to restore Israel and with David. And God laid it out. David knew the plan. It was written down right here. They had this. They had Deuteronomy. It wasn't no surprise. Solomon had this book. He read it, and he knew, and he had the wisdom of good and evil. And so the problem was he messed it up. Plan's not going to work. So there's a price to pay. But the thing about God is he is also always, always faithful. And so the fourth part of this layer is the promise. So there was the plan. Solomon messed it all up with the problem. There was a price that had to be paid. And we're seeing that the promise and the faithfulness is still not gone from God's heart. Because what happens is you see, and what God does is he sends these prophets. And a prophet, we get in our head that a prophet is somebody who tells the future, or a fortune teller kind of thing. And that's not the role of the prophet. The role of the prophet was to tell the king and tell people when they were disobeying God and getting away from God's plan. They were like bumper guards that directed people back. And God gave them this knowledge to help put people back on track. That's how much God loved. He was still faithful to his promises. And he's still faithful to the house of David. And we know he was because Jesus is the ultimate promise that comes out of the promise, the original promise that God made with David. And so, although it seems quite desolate, there's the plan, it went wrong, there's the curse and the price that they have to pay, but you see the promise come up, and then you'll see these stories of the prophets and things that happen, and you can see God's faithfulness to those who are obedient, to those who trust in him. So that's going to be layer number 1 that we're going to talk about. That's like the big flyover. Now I'm going to unwrap a second layer to the book of Kings. And so I'm going to transition a little bit and give you that. So anytime you do like a video recording or teaching, really about 10 minutes is all you can really digest in this kind of a format with someone talking at you from a screen. And so what I recommend is you pause this video or stop here for the day and write out a note. Just write 1-page note of yourself if you're not a note taker, and write the Book of Kings at the top, and then write what was God's plan. And then you write in your own words, what was the plan that God had? His plan was to build his kingdom and for the Israelite people to prosper and flourish and grow under the house of David, and that everything would be prosperous and go wonderful. Then write down what was the problem. The problem is that Solomon's sons, especially Solomon, did not uphold the promise, their end of the covenant with God. They were disobedient. He did all of the things that God told him not to, and gave him a book and wrote it down and said, here, don't do this, and he did this. So what that was problem, and then write down what was the price that Israel had to pay for all of that. And what the ultimate price is that exile, and they are removed from the promised land. It's taken away from them because they break the covenant. And then under that, write the promise, how God is still faithful throughout all of this period of the kings, how he's still, those who trust him, God still provides and cares for them. And there's still that remnant there, and God always is faithful to that. So just kind of write those kind of notes down for yourself so you have them when you're reading, especially if you haven't read um, any of the Kings yet. So kind of just write that down so as you're starting to read through it, that's your first layer. And that might be the only layer you get this time. Um, I'm going to give you a second layer, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Israel and kind of some of the history that's happening within the problem, within the price and the curses, like what is happening in that layer of the story. And if you don't get that this time through, that's okay. But I'm going to lay that out. And like I said, this is a second layer. I probably could do 100 layers in Kings and not be done. So we're going to start at the second layer here, and I'm going to talk more about the actual Israelites, the players, geographically, what is happening to the nation of Israel. Everything was looking great. God established the monarchy. He reestablished the covenant with the Israelite people, with King David, and made David these promises and his people the promises that things would prosper and that they would grow and they would be, protected and things would be great. But there was the if they were obedient, if they followed God, if they put all the other gods behind them, if they did these things. And so we're going to start right there and look at what happened. How did Israel deconstruct, go from that promise with David, the pinnacle of what everything was meant to be, and then it all untwined. So we'll start with Solomon. Solomon building the temple, asking for the ability to discern good from evil. He really, it was the highest of highs, and God's temple was built, and everything was wonderful. But I read that list of don't do this if you're the king, and Solomon started doing all of them. And so he was torn away. And because he did that, there was consequences. There was curses. There was a price to pay. It's set up front in the covenant. Do this or this will happen. Do this, follow me, be obedient. You will be my people. I will take care of you. You will be prosperous. If you turn away from me, this is what will happen. And the letter of the law was all written out, all given up front. And so what happens is, Solomon, not this good example, but his sons really are the ones that end up ripping the kingdom apart. So his one son, Rehoboam, he wants to ascend to the throne. And the people all come to him and they say, Solomon, your dad was so tough on us. He made us basically do slave labor and build all these palaces and all of these things. And would you please be a more gentle king? And we will pledge our allegiance to you. And we will do right by you, King Rehoboam. So King Rehoboam talks to the elders, talks to all these things, and he comes back and he decides to reject everything people have told him. And he says he's going to make a name for himself. And he's like, well, if you think my father was hard, I'm going to be twice as hard on you because I am the king. He was a king. Now I'm the king and I'm going to be tough on you. Well, then what happens is the second son, Jeroboam, Rehoboam and Reg and Jerry. So Jeroboam comes and confronts his brother Rehoboam, and the people are starting to gather around Jeroboam and say, hey, we're going to rebel. We're not going to follow Rehoboam then if he's going to be some tough king. We're going to follow you. You be the king, and you lead us up here. And so what happens is Israel splits in half, and these half of them go up north of Jerusalem with Jeroboam, and the other stay south with Rehoboam. And the actual nation of Israel is broken in half, and it now has two names. The northern part is Israel, and the bottom part is Judah. So from then on in the Bible, you're going to hear those two names. You're going to hear Israel and you're going to hear Judah. And they're geographical locations, and they're under different allegiances. And it started out that in the south, Rehoboam was the one that was in power. And in the north, Jeroboam was the one in power. So when you first get into this story of these two brothers, it looks like Rehoboam is a bad guy. I mean, he ignored what the people said, and he's like, I'm going to be tough, and my father, look, I'm going to build twice as high of palaces, and you're going to be doing all this work. You don't. I'm going to be the king. Well, the thing is, we kind of think that. But then what happens is Jeroboam, he goes up north, and then he is looking at this area strategically. And Jerusalem, where the temple is in the south, where Rehoboam is. And remember, all of the Israelites, they have the rules and the customs, and they have to go to the temple and do all of these things. Well, Jeroboam up here in the north doesn't want his followers to go down to Jerusalem and be with Rehoboam's people and kind of, be like, oh, well, maybe we'll follow him, and that's not so bad. So what Jeroboam does strategically is he says, you don't have to go to Jerusalem if you follow me. You're going to go, I'm going to set up two places where you can conveniently do your worship and sacrifices, like drive-throughs. And he sets one up. The north half of the North Israel has in the middle, the capital is Samaria. And so what strategically Jeroboam does is he puts one of these drive-through worship sacrifices places north and one of them south. So no matter what direction you go, you're going to have to go to one of those places, pop-up temples that he sets up with golden calves, mind you, before you get to Jerusalem. So it's more convenient to go to these new pop-up temples that he builds golden calves in, which again just points back to Deuteronomy and when they set up the golden calves and disobeyed God. And there's so much happening there. And so what ends up happening is because Jeroboam does that and he sets up the golden calves, he seals the fate of the northern part of Israel. And the north never ever really stabilizes or receives favor again from God. It says there's going to be about 20 kings in the north, and there's going to be about 20 kings in the south, Judah, these two regions. And in the north, all 20 of them, it says they were bad kings. They saw no favor, no nothing in the eyes of God. They were bad because they followed the ways of Jeroboam and was led astray with the golden calves and the idol worship. And in the south, you have Rehoboam, which still went to the temple, the people that followed him. They still were set up and followed the rules of the house of David. And you see in the south, there's the same amount of kings, but there's 8 of these kings that it says in the Bible they were good. Well, they weren't really good kings, but they were okay kings. They weren't evil. They weren't contramanding God's will, but they weren't making the right choices and decisions as well. So what ends up happening is the north, um, that whole territory ends up being taken over by the Assyrians, and the Assyrian king sends it's his the custom that they come in the lands they conquer, they relocate all of the people that they conquer, they relocate them outside of the area and scatter and disperse them, and that's how they stay in power. So the south falls first, and the Israel of the north, the Israelite people are sent into exile, and they have lost their foothold in the promised land. It's gone. They lost it. And Jerusalem and Judah, the southern part, does eventually fall and go into exile as well. Near the end, you'll hear the story of a king called Hezekiah. And what Hezekiah ends up doing is he wants to save Jerusalem. He wants to save Judah. In a last ditch effort, he tries to sell and bribe off the kings by selling all the gold and stuff from the temple. So all of the temple, the gold and all of that gets taken from the temple, and then eventually the come into the south, and the south is lost, and they are oppressed, and the southern Judah is sent into exile as well. So this is what happens over the course in the second layer. This is how the tribes are ripped apart. It's the deconstruction. So you had the exodus of them leaving Egypt, and then the entering into the promised land, and that's a period of 600 to 800 years where all of that happened. And then we have this other couple hundred years where very quickly they are reversed back out, and they are removed from the promised land, and because they did not ever fall into faithful obedience to God. But God's still faithful, and he still sends promises. And so intertwined in all of these things is where you're going to see the faithfulness of God. You're going to see the stories of the different prophets, of the different people, and you're going to see these stories intertwined into the book of Kings, Chronicles, and the prophets, and you're going to see God was still working. God was still in control, even when the Israelites were not obedient. God was able, he had the power, but the people just wouldn't obey. And so you're going to see that, and you know, again, don't be overwhelmed. There's so much more to learn, but be excited by that, because you're going to make your own discoveries and say, you know, look at what God is showing me through this. He's showing me that there's hope, that he's faithful, that even when everything goes wrong and no one is being obedient and no one's doing what they're supposed to be doing, if I am faithful and I trust him, he's going to take care of me. So just kind of rest in that. So that is a long overview of Kings. Like I said, it is so much information to get through, but I hope that helps a little bit, and that you guys don't get overwhelmed and you get excited about it, like me. And you know, send me questions. I probably won't know the answers, but I will look into them for you. And yeah, so keep going. It's been a struggle. It's been a struggle for me to have the energy to come up with the reading and the teaching and the studying and now doing the work and stuff. But you're keeping me accountable, and so I'm going to try to encourage you to keep doing it. Keep doing it. We're in Kings. Stick out in Kings for a while till you get a grasp of it, and then we're going to move on to Chronicles. So